Hey everyone, welcome back to another biology video. Today we are going to be taking a look at evolution and the four factors that make evolution possible. You should be up to date on your homework, but if you haven't already finished watching videos 2.1 through 2.4, please make sure you go back and watch those first because that will just make this video make a lot more sense because we're building off of what we already learned with natural selection. Okay, so here is our learning goal for evolution. It says, construct an explanation based on evidence that the process of evolution primarily results from four factors. And then it lists the four factors. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at what each of those four factors mean. But before we dive in, we can already start seeing some things that are familiar to us in this image that is labeled the theory of evolution by natural selection. So, natural selection is like a mechanism that leads to evolution. So, it's like there is a lot of overlap. They're not exactly the same thing, but when we talk about natural selection, we're often talking about leading to evolution over time. All right, so the first factor or condition that has to be true in order for evolution to take place is that the potential for a species to increase in number must exist. So all this means is that the species is able to reproduce and the population is able to grow. These two graphs show us population growth. The first graph shows us exponential growth. This is not really possible in the real world, but we'll talk about that later on this year when we learn about something called carrying capacity. But this graph just shows that after a while of increasing, the population will start to level out because it reaches capacity. So that's how a population is typically going to grow, and it grows with the help of reproduction. So, depending on the type of organism, reproduction happens in different ways. There is either asexual reproduction, which there's a lot of even different ways that different species use asexual reproduction. But important things to know are that since there's only one parent, we're just making clones or copies. So the genetic information would be the same from like parent to offspring. And that it can happen really fast because there's not a need for another organism to mate with. Compared to sexual reproduction, can be a longer process, and it also leads to much more variation. So again, this is something we're going to get into in more detail later on this year, but based on reproduction and depending on the type of organism, we see that there's potential for a species to increase in number. The second factor that can lead to evolution is the heritable genetic variation of individuals in a species due to mutation and sexual reproduction. Okay, so let's unpack this. First, we have heritable. Heritable sounds like inherit. So when we see the word heritable, we're thinking traits are being passed down from parent to offspring. Okay, some other keywords here are genetic, which we just want to think about DNA when we're thinking about genetic. And then we have variation. So variation is, you might think, variety. This just means differences. And traits. So this is what these pictures are showing us with the eye color. Those are all variations in eye color. We also see variations in the pictures of the cats, all the same species, but all having different fur color traits. That is variation. There's also examples of variation that we can't see. An example of this is when someone is lactose intolerant and they don't make the enzyme needed to break down lactose. They don't make lactase, compared with someone who is not lactose intolerant can produce the enzyme lactase. So the first part is that there is variation, and the second part is talking about where this variation comes from. So variation typically comes from mutations, and we know that mutations is a random, permanent change to DNA. Okay, and again, this is something we're going to get into way more in depth later on this year, but we need to understand that we get our traits from our DNA, and so if that DNA gets changed, it will have an effect on our traits. So, for example, if the normal trait for, let's say, eye color is historically this. Okay. And then this is how that DNA gets replicated, but there's a mistake. So this G here should have been a C. Okay. When we're talking about a mutation with DNA, we're just talking about one little tiny change, just like that. And that can lead to a totally different outcome, which is how a lot of variation gets introduced. Randomly happens based on some mistake in the DNA. The other way that variation is showing up is because of sexual reproduction. Okay, so this sort of family tree here shows us a representation of sexual reproduction, where we have one parent here passes along half of its DNA for its offspring, while the other half looks like the other parent. Okay. And then those two parents have an offspring that are half and half again, and so on and so forth. But because of the randomness of this process in many different ways, it is always introducing more and more and more variation. So we were just mentioning asexual reproduction, we're making copies. In sexual reproduction, more and more variation is introduced all the time. And so it can encourage evolution to happen because of these different traits that are showing up. Most of this we're going to get into way more in depth later in the year, so this is just a look ahead at some of those different topics. All right, the third part of evolution is that there has to be competition. So this is pretty self-explanatory. There are many things that species or organisms may compete for. It might be for a mate, it might be for a food or water or habitat space. All of these things might be reasons to compete, but based on the fact that there is competition for a limited amount of resources, we know that it will lead to some of these individuals surviving and some of them losing, some of them being outcompeted for those limited resources. So again, we're seeing this idea of carrying capacity show up. Again, we'll get to that more later, but there's competition, which means that some are going to basically win the competition and survive, and some are going to lose the competition and die and not pass on their traits. The last is that there has to be proliferation of organisms that are better able to survive and reproduce in the environment. Okay, so it seems like a scary word, but proliferation It just means that there's reproduction happening. Okay, so the organisms are reproducing when they are better able to survive and reproduce in the environment. Okay, we've already seen a bunch of examples of this with natural selection. We know that when the trees were dark, the dark moths were better camouflaged, and so therefore they survived and reproduced. We saw their populations increase, while the light moths were not camouflaged and their populations decreased over time. We saw just briefly with giraffes that over time, average neck length is increasing because the longer neck giraffes were better able to survive and reproduce. And we saw the same thing happen when we were reading about antibiotic resistance with the bacteria populations. The bacteria that had the resistance, they had a random mutation that led to their resistance. They survived the antibiotics and then they reproduced, passing on their trait of antibiotic resistance. All right, that's all for our first video about evolution. A lot of it should sound really familiar, and then a lot of it we're going to dive into later on this year, so it's just a early look ahead. Let's look ahead now at our assessment calendar. We have an assessment coming up for evolution. Our first assessment for this learning goal is going to be either on Thursday or Friday this week for evolution assessment number 1. Some other things coming up on Monday or Tuesday next week. We have an assessment that is going to be about natural selection and focusing on the data analysis. So definitely make sure, like I said in the beginning, if you have not caught up on those natural selection videos, please make sure you do that so that you're prepared and you're not falling further behind. And then plan on coming to office hours if any of this is not really making sense to you. Okay, have a great day, everybody. We'll see you in class. Bye.